For the past decade, millions of professionals have tried to solve the same quiet problem with increasingly sophisticated tools. Budgeting apps, automated trackers, subscription dashboards, perfectly categorized spending reports. On paper, the system looks flawless. Every dollar is recorded, every category visualized, every trend analyzed. And yet, something strange keeps happening inside otherwise stable households. Income rises, financial knowledge improves, the tools become smarter, but the savings rate barely moves. In some cases, it even shrinks, which raises an uncomfortable possibility most people never consider. What if the problem was never about discipline or knowledge, or even income at all? What if the system people rely on to control their money was never actually designed to change their behavior in the first place?
The truth is that saving money is not actually a complicated problem. Most people assume it is. Entire industries exist to convince us that personal finance requires advanced tools, optimization strategies, and constant monitoring. But if you step back and look carefully at the data across households, across countries, and across decades, something becomes obvious. The people who consistently build financial stability are not necessarily the ones with the highest income, the most advanced financial apps, or the most detailed spreadsheets. They are the people who quietly create a margin between what they earn and what they deploy into daily consumption. That margin becomes their profit. And like any well-run business, the presence of profit margin determines whether the system survives stress. On the surface, this makes the situation feel reassuring. If financial stability is simply about maintaining margin, then the problem should be straightforward. Earn money, spend a little less than you earn, and the difference compounds over time. Simple, clean, logical. But then something strange appears when you look at real households. A surprising number of professionals earning comfortable incomes still feel like money evaporates every month. They are not reckless. They are not irresponsible. They follow the standard advice. They pay their bills on time. They contribute to retirement accounts. They use budgeting apps. And yet the savings account grows slower than expected. The margin is thinner than it should be. Sometimes it disappears entirely. The spreadsheet says the plan should work. The reality says something else is happening underneath the surface. At first glance, it looks like a discipline problem. That's the default explanation. Spend less, track more carefully, cut unnecessary expenses. But the deeper you look, the less convincing that explanation becomes, because many of the systems people rely on today were designed primarily to record behavior, not to influence it. Budgeting software tracks spending beautifully. It categorizes every transaction with perfect precision. It generates elegant charts that visualize where the money went. But those charts appear after the behavior has already happened. They are historical records, not decision systems. They show the result of consumption, not the moment where consumption could have been prevented. That distinction creates a quiet structural gap. When spending decisions are frictionless, awareness disappears. Modern financial tools remove almost all resistance from purchasing behavior. Payments happen automatically. Subscriptions renew silently. One-click ordering eliminates the pause that used to exist between desire and transaction. From a system design perspective, consumption has become extremely efficient, and efficiency without reflection tends to produce the same outcome every time: gradual lifestyle creep. Lifestyle creep is rarely dramatic. It doesn't feel reckless in the moment. It arrives through small upgrades, slightly better services, slightly more convenience, slightly higher comfort. Individually, each decision seems harmless, but collectively, they compress your financial margin. And once that margin shrinks, the entire system becomes fragile. Income is still strong. The appearance of success remains intact, but optionality begins to disappear. This is where a different perspective on money becomes useful. In Japan, financial behavior historically developed under a cultural lens that treats resources with a kind of quiet respect, not in a moralistic sense and not through strict deprivation, but through awareness of the effort embedded inside every object and every purchase. When you adopt that lens, waste stops being a purely economic concept. It becomes a breakdown in the relationship between effort and value. Think about what money actually represents. It is not just currency, it is the stored conversion of labor. hours of work compressed into a transferable form. When that stored labor is deployed casually, the connection between effort and outcome weakens. And once that connection weakens, consumption becomes automatic. The system begins to drift. One principle that emerged from Japanese lifestyle philosophy is surprisingly simple: stop before the maximum. In daily life, this idea appears in many contexts, but its financial translation is particularly interesting. Instead of designing life around consuming everything that comes in, the structure is reversed. A portion of income is removed from circulation immediately. What remains becomes the operating budget. In business terms, this mirrors profit-first accounting. Revenue enters the system, profit is extracted at the beginning, and the organization learns to operate within the remaining resources. The psychological effect of this reversal is subtle but powerful. Human behavior adapts to constraints. When people consistently live on slightly less than their total income, their baseline expectations adjust downward. The perceived definition of enough begins to shift downward while financial resilience begins to expand upward. Over time, this creates something more valuable than savings alone. It creates optionality. Optionality is one of the most underrated financial advantages. When you have liquidity, you gain the ability to make decisions based on strategy rather than pressure. You can tolerate volatility. You can wait for better opportunities. You can avoid forced decisions. Without optionality, every financial choice becomes reactive. But philosophy alone does not change behavior. Ideas need a mechanism, and one of the simplest mechanisms ever created for this purpose came from an unlikely place: a household notebook. The system itself is almost disarmingly simple. At the beginning of each month, you write down your available income. You define how much of it will remain untouched as savings. And then throughout the month, every purchase is recorded manually. No automation, no background syncing, no invisible categorization. Each transaction requires a moment of conscious recognition. That small moment matters more than most people expect. Writing something by hand creates a different cognitive process than observing it on a screen. When a purchase appears automatically inside an app, the brain processes it as passive information. When you write it down yourself, the brain processes it as a decision that belongs to you. That difference sounds trivial, but behaviorally, it changes everything. Suddenly, spending stops being invisible. Each transaction carries a brief moment of awareness, and once awareness enters the system, patterns begin to reveal themselves. Certain purchases consistently produce satisfaction. Others quietly produce regret. Some categories feel aligned with long-term goals. Others feel like momentum spending, transactions that simply happens because there was no friction preventing them. Over time, a psychological shift begins to occur. The notebook stops being a budgeting tool and becomes something closer to a mirror. It reflects the relationship between your labor and your consumption. And that reflection is often the first moment people realize that financial stress is not always caused by lack of income. It's often caused by misalignment between identity and spending behavior. Many professionals today experience a strange contradiction. Their external life signals success: good salary, modern conveniences, high-quality services. Yet internally, they feel behind. The gap between appearance and security becomes uncomfortable. That gap exists because looking wealthy and being wealthy are not the same thing. Looking wealthy requires continuous consumption. Being wealthy requires retained margin. The notebook system quietly forces that distinction into the open, not through guilt, not through strict rules, but through repeated observation. Over months, you begin to see where your capital is actually going, and once you see it clearly, the system begins to correct itself. This leads to a simple but powerful framework. You can think of personal finance not as budgeting, but as capital deployment. Your income is the inflow of capital. Each purchase is a deployment decision. Some deployments build future autonomy. Others simply convert capital into short-lived experiences. Both are valid, but confusion between them creates financial stagnation. When people regain clarity about where their capital is flowing, behavior naturally adjusts. Not dramatically, not overnight, but gradually enough that the margin begins to widen again. And once margin widens, compounding finally has space to operate. Looking forward, this shift may become increasingly important. Modern economies are becoming more consumption optimized every year. Convenience continues to improve. Friction continues to disappear. Algorithms are designed to accelerate purchasing behavior. The default trajectory for most households will continue pushing towards higher consumption unless deliberate counterweights are introduced. That is why simple systems often outperform complex ones. They introduce friction where friction is useful. They slow decisions that benefit from reflection. And they reconnect daily behavior to long-term trajectory. If you step back and think about the bigger picture, financial independence is not really about maximizing returns or discovering secret strategies. At its core, it's about converting labor into freedom. Every dollar retained becomes stored optionality. Every decision to maintain margin increases the distance between your identity and the pressure of immediate income. And this is where I want to leave you with something to think about, especially if you've been watching this channel for a while. Nick Finance exists for people who are tired of being treated like consumers of financial content, instead of operators of financial systems. The goal here is not to flood you with tactics or promise shortcuts. The goal is to help you think about money with the same clarity you would apply to building a business. Because in many ways, your personal financial life is a business. You have revenue, you have operating costs, you have capital allocation decisions, and you have one critical metric that determines the trajectory of everything else: profit margin. When your financial life has margin, you gain leverage over your future. When margin disappears, the system begins to control you. Most financial advice focuses on surface actions: spend less, save more, invest regularly.